Hey everyone, we'll get started in just a couple minutes. If you want to just hang on, and we'll just make sure that everyone has a chance to log on before we get started. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Let me share my webcam so you can see me. Does that work? There we go. I hope everyone's doing well today, enjoyed their week. I'm looking forward to the weekend myself, but I'm glad we're able to be here together. So we're going to be talking about addressing and understanding trauma through mentoring. This is a topic that is really important to me that I've spent a lot of my work focusing on, so I'm always excited to talk about it. As we get started, if you do have any specific questions, please put those in the question box. Yeah, we'll get started. If you wouldn't mind doing me a favor quickly and just sticking just a note in the question box, let me know you can hear me okay and that everything's, you can see the PowerPoint and the webcam and all that, and then we'll get started. Awesome. At least one person can see and hear me, so I assume that means everyone else can. So we'll get started. So most of you, if you've been coming to our webinars and events, you've gotten to know me a little bit. My name is Jack Kavanaugh. I'm with Mentor in New York. I am our Director of Training and Program Development. I'm based out of our Western New York office in Buffalo, but we also, have our offices in New York City and Long Island. My background is in social work. I have a master's and license in social work. I've worked in youth programs for about 15 years now. Yeah, I mean 15 years in October since my first youth job. So it's basically, all I've ever done. And so I like to talk about it because it's the only thing I know how to talk about. So again, if you do have any questions as we're going through, this is something that I can, talk a lot about, but ultimately, we want to make sure I'm addressing things that are, useful for you and relevant to you. So please, throw some questions in, things that you're curious about, make sure you stick them in there. Some I might answer while we're going, some I might save till the end, but I'll try to get everyone's questions answered. So let's go. So trauma. Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. This is something that's, I think, a really important way to frame and have this conversation around trauma. It's I think one of the best ways to really talk about and define trauma is that traumatic events are things that, shake our foundations of the way we believe the world is supposed to function. So if we spend all of our lives thinking that the world works and exists in one specific way, and then an event happens that just shatters that can be deeply traumatic, right? And so those things that are also just so overwhelming to us that we just can't use our normal coping skills in order to help overwhelm them. Oh, I just realized it always says Brenda's name when I log in. I'll take that so you can see that it's actually me. I have to change this every time. There we go. So, and that's really, we talk about trauma, that's really what it is, right? It's those things that are so either like earth shattering to our like base assumptions about the way the world functions, or so deeply overwhelming to us that just, all of our coping skills are just overwhelmed. So how do we define trauma? So individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that are experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. I'll talk about that in a second. Trauma has lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning and well-being, and that trauma is defined by the person having the experience. So starting with that first point, I think it's really easy sometimes we talk about the way that trauma impacts us. So if we talk about psychological trauma, sometimes we'll think about it in the same way we would think of physical trauma, right? Like a car accident or an assault, or like there's a specific event that happens. But one of the other ways that trauma materializes and functions, especially for a lot of young people, is it's almost more like you're in a room that's just slowly filling with water, right? And you don't know when it's going to when it's going to be like full or when it's going to drain. Like that stress, that anxiety in your brain of just not knowing what's happening and not being in control, right? And so that's a really harsh reality for a lot of young people, when they're thinking about I don't know where I'm going to be sleeping tonight. I don't know what I'm going to be eating tonight. Am I going to have to go home and deal with parents who are struggling with addiction or domestic violence, or all these things? That constant stress, that constant pumping of those cortisol and other stress hormones to your brain is very harmful, and so we want to avoid that as much as possible. It has lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning and well-being. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But all of the different things that happen to us, psychologically, that are deeply traumatic, are things that affect us, 10, 15, 20 years down the road in ways that we can't always predict. And lastly, determined by the person having the experience. The two people can have go through the exact same experience, and one person can process it, internalize it as a trauma, and the other person might not. And that's okay. That's very normal. And there's a lot of different factors that, break that shift. On top of that, not only can, whether or not it's trauma differ between two people, but the way that it's, the way that it's demonstrated, or the way they kind of, the way their behaviors might shift also depends. So the example I always use of this is, I don't know if anyone's ever seen this movie, but I like it. But it's called, from the early 90s, there was a movie, Fearless, with Jeff Bridges and Rosie Perez. And the plot of the movie is there's a plane crash. And Rosie Perez and Jeff Bridges' characters are the only two survivors of the plane crash. And the movie is about the ways that they deal with that. And so for Jeff Bridges' character, he internalizes this whole idea of invincibility, right? He's like, I survived this plane crash, so I must be, completely invincible. And for Rosie Perez's character, who had a young son who did pass away on the flight or in the crash, she deals with it with a lot of survivors' guilt and things like that. And it's about their relationship. But it's these two people who deal with this, trauma in very different ways and start to process it in very different ways, even though they went through the same experience. So, forms of trauma. So the biggest one is, of course, primary trauma. Something bad happens to me. That is, primary trauma. you know, that's what we tend to think of, right? So it directly impacts me. I was in a car accident. I was sexually assaulted. I was dealing with homelessness at home, things like that. I'm the one impacted it. Secondary trauma, or vicarious trauma, it's sometimes called, is things that people like us who work with young people experience through them. So, you know, if you have a young person who is sharing their story of um, something that was really, so, you know, a sexual assault or a, you know, they were mugged on the street or something like that, and then you're impacted by that, you know, because, you know, as people who work with young people, we are, we want to be empathetic, we want to be understanding, we want to be able to understand and listen and hear them, but we can still be really affected by that, you know, understanding how that impacts us, and that's that secondary or vicarious trauma. The last one is shared trauma or collective trauma. And I think a good example of that is just what's happening right now in the world. You know, we're all undergoing this traumatic experience of our lives being deeply disrupted. You know, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of stress, a lot of mistrust, and we're all kind of going through it together. And so things like this are really about, you know, understanding that all of us are experiencing something right now together. So I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but we'll talk a minute or two about the, you know, neurobiology of trauma. So, you know, what exactly is trauma and how does it function? There we go. So, you know, we talked a bit about before about some of the physical impacts. I don't really love the terminology here of like healthy brain and abused brain. I think that's a little, you know, reductionist, but you know, it is what it is. But the picture I enjoyed because it shows you the way that, you know, experiencing trauma and abuse as a young person impacts our brain and impacts the way that the human brain, specifically, you can see the temporal lobes is the part of our brain that forms memories. It's the part of our brain that is related to for memories and memory recall. And so when we undergo a traumatic experience, you know, so if you're, say, driving your car on the highway and a big semi truck in front of you loses control and starts coming into your lane and, you know, hits the car. While that's happening, your brain is processing all of this stuff that's happening, reading the situation and pumping your brain full of stress hormones, so cortisol especially, adrenaline, all of this stuff. So your brain in your temporal lobe is coding that experience with like stress, anxiety, trauma, bad, right? It's telling your brain these are terrible things that are happening. And so the next time that your brain starts to see those same things happening again, it's going to remember, oh, you know, this is highlighted as a bad thing. So I'm on the highway in the left lane, there's a semi truck here. My brain's going to remember that, and I'm going to have that reaction based on my memories. And that's like what we mean when we talk about, you know, having traumas be triggered, things like that. You have certain experiences that might even be innocuous or unrelated to, you know, it could be a smell, it could be a specific sound, something, but that because your brain has coded that, highlighted it as associated with something just, you know, danger, like get out of there, you know, that's just something bad. That's how we deal with it. So let's go to the next one. So we talk about the adverse childhood experiences study. So some of you may be familiar with this. It was a study they did in the early 1990s. And what they did was in California, it was actually through Kaiser Permanente was who did it, so an HMO in California. As people were coming in that year for their routine checkups, they gave them a brief survey where they asked them about their adverse childhood experiences, what they called it, or ACEs. So they surveyed over 17,000 people in Southern California and started to plot that against other outcomes. So specifically, health outcomes. Are these people who had physical health issues later in life? That's what they kind of wanted to see. And so the ACEs, were there 9 of them. I really like this picture, but it only has 8. And so I still use it because I just think it's a good graphic. but there's actually 9. But the 8 adverse childhood experiences were physical abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, and then household dysfunction, including mental illness, incarcerated relative, mother treated violently, substance abuse, and then the one that's not on here is divorce. So having divorce in the household as a child. And so what they did was they would assign someone, they called it an ACE score. So how many of these ACEs did this person experience early in their life on a scale of 1 to 9? And then they started looking at that against their like current health outcomes. So like how physically healthy are they now? Because they were there for their physical. And they had three major takeaways. The first one was that these were just much more common experiences than they had previously thought. Just the number of people who had these adverse childhood experiences was just more than they anticipated. And so we're talking about they pulled 18,000 people from Southern California. These were predominantly, white, middle to upper class families. And so, especially in the 90s, they were not thinking that those were the types of families or people who would have had these experiences, right? We associated these, with poverty, with, living in communities of color, all these different things, because the way we know that some of these issues fall, homelessness, abuse, neglect, mental illness, drug use. But that was incorrect, right? This we know now in 2020 is that these things affect everybody, regardless of who you are. So that was the first takeaway. The second one was that they tend to cluster. So, and I think this makes sense if you think about it, but you rarely see someone with an ACE score of like 3. Usually you would see maybe 1 or 2, or like 6, 7, 8. And I think if you think about that again, it makes sense, right? If you have someone who has mental illness in the household, what we know about mental illness is that mental illness and substance abuse tend to go hand in hand. If you have someone with mental illness and substance abuse issues, there's a chance that someone's going to be incarcerated. If someone's incarcerated, then we know that there might be some, physical neglect. They can't get the food and housing that they need. They're not able to, buy groceries. There could be some abuse, especially around addiction issues, things like that. Divorce, all of them, you can see how they kind of feed into each other. And so that was the second takeaway. And the third one, and the one that really I think was the most surprising to the researchers, was that higher ACE scores correlated directly with poor physical health outcomes later in life. And I think this is important to talk about because it gives us an image of why talking about and addressing trauma is so important. It's not as simple as just these are young people who had some type of bad experience, and it's just sad that they had to go through this. It is sad that they have to go through that, but it has very real, very very real physical impacts on their lives, and that's what's really important for us to be able to address. And so what they found was this, they call this the ACE pyramid. So at the bottom is those adverse childhood experiences, right, that we talked about. So then above that, because of those ACEs, disrupted neurodevelopment. So, we talked about how a lot of the trauma and the stress hormones impact our brain, right? And so if your brain is constantly being flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, then your brain's not going to be able to fully function the way it's supposed to. It's going to limit its development. If you're not getting the food and shelter that you need, and your brain can't fully develop as a young person. I mean, I'm talking about people who are, 6, 18 months old even, all the way up to, young adulthood. And so if your brain can't fully develop, you're going to have social, emotional, and cognitive impairments of some degree or another. And so that leads into the adoption of health risk behaviors, whether it's drug use, alcohol abuse, risky sexual behaviors, tobacco use, whatever it is. So you adopt those health risk behaviors, which then leads to disease, disability, and social problems, which leads to early death. Obviously, this is a pyramid, right? So not everyone who has an adverse childhood experience goes up, but they started able to draw the correlation between people who had more of these experiences when they were younger with people who had serious health problems as adults. And that was a really important, I think, step for us as people who work with and care about young people and figuring out, how do we best work with and address their needs and make sure that they're, functional adults. I got ahead of myself and I already talked about this slide. But what you can see is, the number of ACEs and the risk for negative health and well-being outcomes. So the higher the ACE scores, the higher the risk. So now that we know that, what do we do about it? How do we start infusing some of that in our work? It's one thing to talk about and understand these issues and that they exist, but it's another thing to figure out how does that impact the work that we do. And so that's where the trauma-informed perspective really comes in. So first is the key principles. Safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and understanding of cultural, historical, and gender issues. Safety is the most important. It's the foundation, right? We want to make sure that we are creating spaces and relationships where young people can feel safe, where they feel like they can bring their entire selves with them. They don't have to leave part of themselves at home, right? These are spaces and relationships where they can be themselves and they can feel safe and cared about. And that's the foundation. That's where it all starts. Second, trustworthiness and transparency, right? It's as simple as saying, hey, I'm going to talk to you Friday at 2 o'clock. And then at Friday at 2 o'clock, you actually do it. And if you can't do it, then you're honest and transparent about why not, right? We want to have, and model that kind of open and transparent communication with young people. We want to inform them. We want to keep them part of the loop. We want them to be informed about decisions that are affecting them. And we want to make sure that where they give us trust, we respect and honor that trust. Because for a lot of young people, especially who have more traumas in their background, they are not necessarily used to having adults that actually follow through and adults who are trustworthy and transparent. And so for us to be able to figure out how do we start healing some of those wounds that they've experienced, it's by modeling and showing that we are trustworthy and transparent ourselves. Peer support is crucial. One of the biggest, and we'll talk about this in a little bit in a minute, but talking about, two people experience the same event and one person experiences the trauma, the other person doesn't. And one of the biggest, there's a number of variables that kind of go into that. And I think part of it is things that we just honestly don't understand completely yet. But I do know that, we found that one of the biggest ones is around, shame and feeling, ashamed. And so the more that we can connect peers with people to be able to say, you don't need to feel shame about that experience. I experienced that too. It's normal. I'm sorry you had to experience that. It's not your fault. It's not your fault that your mother is using. It's not your fault that you don't have food at home. You don't have to feel embarrassed about that. I experienced that too. And connecting young people together to have those experiences and talk about them in a way that's, open and honest, can be part of those things that really helps create that healing. Collaboration and mutuality, it's exactly what it sounds like, right? We want young people to work together and we want to be able to work together with them. So, how do we incorporate things like, youth on our board of directors? How do we have a youth advisory committee? How do we allow them to make choices about programming that affects them? And that could be as simple as, hey, when and where am I going to meet with my mentor? Why don't I let the mentee decide that? Pick where we're going to go. We're going to go get ice cream. You want to go to your favorite place instead of mine? Let's do it. Which day do you want to go? All those little things. I don't know about where you guys are, over in Schenectady, but for us in Buffalo, I know one of the things that I've seen, especially in the Buffalo public schools, is, kids can go a full day at school without ever having to make a choice for themselves, right? Everything is decided for them. What time they have to be there, what time they go home, what time they have to be in this room or that room, where they sit, what they eat, what they're reading. Every little thing is decided for them ahead of time. And so for us, as people who are working with young people outside of a school setting, especially, being able to create those spaces where they're able to make choices, they're able to put into practice things that they might not be able to experience otherwise, and helping develop them as leaders is really important. Empowerment, voice, and choice. I guess I kind of segued into that one organically. And an understanding of cultural, historical, and gender issues, which we'll talk about in a minute. We'll do this slide first, though. So this is the 4 R's. So this is really like, I think when we think about, again, how do we actually take all this stuff and start thinking about how do we do it in our work? So the first one is realizing. So we realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery. I mean, and that's what we're doing right now. This is just having conversations around trauma exists. It's much more common than we would think. It's more likely than not that the person in front of you has had experiences, some traumas in their life. And this is what potential paths for recovery might look like. This is that just learning, right? Just gathering as much information as possible about the way that this stuff functions in the world. Once we've done that, then we can start to recognize it. So recognizing it in terms of what are the signs and symptoms of trauma? What are things that we can kind of be on the lookout for? Like that realization of we understand, in the back of our head, this is a thing that happens and exists in the world. And then that recognition is like, okay, I know it exists in the world, but what does it look like when it's in front of me? And starting to understand that. And both our, young people as well as their families, our own staff, helping professions like education, social work, nursing have much higher rates of people who've experienced trauma than other professions. I think there's a number of reasons for that. One of them is that, if you've experienced some type of trauma as a young person and someone helped you, you might want to be able to give back and also help people in the future as you were helped. Or if you experience something and no one was there to support you, you want to make sure someone is there to support the next person who's experiencing that. And so in the work that we do, there's a much higher rate of people who have experienced these things just by virtue of the field. So once we know about it, we start to recognize it when it's in front of us, and then we talk about responding, right? So we fully integrate that knowledge about that trauma into our policies, procedures, and practices. So, part of that is, and we'll talk about in a minute, some strategies of just like in the moment, how do I address this one-on-one with a young person? What are some tips that I can give them? What are some activities that I can do with them? There's that kind of element to it. And then there's also that other side of it, which is how do we start, doing our policies, procedures, and the way we operate as a program that respects and understands that these things exist. So it could be as simple as just making sure that, all of your materials are, in multiple languages, right? Or, what are those sites that we are having, trying to think of like the way to say it, but like when I was working in the schools, one of the things that would always come up would be, frustration with parents not coming and being engaged. And one of the things that happened with the schools, and especially in a community like ours, like in Buffalo, and I don't know if this is true there as well, but I imagine, somewhat, that a lot of times these parents are, they grew up in the same community that they're living in now. They may have gone to the same school that they went to, that they're going to, that their kids go to now. They may even have the same teachers or principals or administrators. And, they don't look back on that time of their life with any real fondness, especially if they experienced, had issues when they were in high school, or they were dealing with childhood trauma, whatever it was. And so now they're adults as parents, and then we're surprised that they don't want to come into the school. And so, like, making sure that these spaces is that a space, a community that is reflective of, is it a place of healing, or are we creating spaces of re-traumatization, right? That's that, what are those things that we look like? And getting to know, and ultimately that starts getting to know the people in your community, the parents, and then also starting to look at who are the people that are not here? Who are the people that are not part of our program that we, want to be able to get from the community? And let's go have conversations with them about what are the barriers to coming? What is it about us that, is unappealing for whatever reason? And then we have that resist re-traumatization, which is, I think, again, I kind of segued into that one naturally, so I won't go too much on it, but, we want to make sure that, that all of the work that we're doing is, fully challenging that. All right. So cultural humility and sensitivity. There's a lot of different words that people will use for this type of stuff, whether that's cultural humility, cultural sensitivity, cultural competence, whatever it is. I prefer the term cultural humility for a number of reasons. I think that things like cultural competence, for example, imply that there's some end point. There's a point at which we're competent, we're good, like I got it, I know everything. And I don't think that's really the case. I think we have to maintain a constant learning and a constant ongoing process. And so it starts with this awareness that the cultural differences and similarities between people exist, right? I have cultural differences from people from, my coworkers in New York City, just from, Buffalo to New York City. Whether that's racial, whether that's ethnic, we have worked with lots of programs that work with immigrant and refugee communities, and this comes up a lot. Working with the LGBTQ community, this comes up a lot. Cultural differences across genders, all sorts of different things. And they exist, and that's okay. People are different. Cultural realities, create different people with differing values, and that's okay. That cultural humility comes in with the awareness that they exist and understanding that just because they exist doesn't mean one is inherently better than the other, right? The way that I interpret and interact with the world is not inherently more right than the way that anyone else does it. And so, that cultural humility piece of it starts with, I think sometimes we as adults, when we're working with youth, we approach things from the perspective of, we have to be the expert in the situation, right? We have to come in and feel like we understand everything beforehand. And, to me, that's faulty, right? That's how we start off on the wrong foot. It's important that we understand, but it's not a prerequisite. It's not the starting place. If I'm working with young people who are from a different culture than me, we can learn from them. We can ask them. We can have conversations and ask them questions. And that's where this real stuff really comes in. It's understanding and, honing those skills of how to learn, how to be inquisitive, how to be, open to being the fact that I don't have to be the expert about everything, that other people can be the experts on their own culture and they can teach me about it. I think that's a really important perspective to start from. And so secondly, actively moving past cultural stereotypes and biases, right? So recognizing that, we all have differences. As humans, we all have stereotypes and biases in our brains, and that's just part of being human. What we can do as adults is choose how to act on them or not. Choose to say, oh, that's a messed up thing for me to be thinking or saying. I'm gonna just shove that away, right? In mental health treatment, they'll talk a lot about, cognitive behavioral therapy uses the CBT triangle. So you have thoughts, behaviors, actions. And so we have these, the premise being we have these unconscious thoughts that pop into our brain that we can't control. Those become feelings and those become actions. And in a lot of ways, things like stereotype and bias work in the same way. We have these unconscious thoughts that pop into our brain, and then those can become feelings, which can become actions. The trick is to take those thoughts that pop into your brain and be like, that's not true, or I'm just going to ignore that, right? And starting to think about where are our own biases. We all have them. We just have to know where they are so we can figure out how to better manage them so that they don't actually become those, feelings and actions. And lastly, highlighting the importance and addressing historical trauma. Things like the example I use for this is, I was raised Jewish, and I had grandparents that, for them, they have memories of the Holocaust and what that was like for them in the 40s. And for the most part, my family was in the United States at the time, but that fear and that trauma was very real of what was happening to their family members in Europe, on top of the anti-Semitism that they're dealing with here. And it's not something that I ever experienced. I mean, this was, 50, 60, 40, however many years before I was even born. But I'm still impacted by it because my ancestors were, and that changed their values that were taught to me and the way I interact with the world because of the things that they experienced long before I was born. And we see this with the legacy of slavery in America. We see this with the legacy of, in the Irish community of, the way that the Irish were treated in the 1880s and, through the 1920s especially. We see that in all sorts of different communities around, even on a very micro scale. Neighborhoods in your communities might have long memories of when grandparents lived in neighborhoods and were treated a certain way or whatever it is. But the point is that these things can be passed down through generations. So how do we support young people in the wake of violence and trauma? What can we do in our day-to-day? So here's a few different things. Don't worry, you'll get all the slides. So I know I try not to put this much text on slides usually, but I wanted to get all on one. But you'll get it all, so don't feel like you have to, memorize this or anything. But the first one is, define your roles, do your homework, and know yourself. If we're doing it, I am a licensed social worker. If I am a mentor, or I do like my church's youth group, in that setting, I'm not a licensed social worker. My role is different. And so I'm not going to be doing counseling with those kids, right? I'm going to hand that off to someone else because that's not my role in that situation. And so when we're talking about especially really sensitive topics like this, we want to make sure that those roles and expectations are clear. And that's really important because people really function much better when they have those really clear expectations. And they know, like, when it gets to this point, that's when you hand it off. When it gets to the point of someone's really talking about things that you're not comfortable with, that's okay. You let us know. And we'll handle it, or here are the numbers for crisis services, or whatever it is. But having that policy in place so that they feel that their role is clearly defined is really important. Doing that homework to know what are the other resources in the community, what are those things when something is too much for me or I don't know how to deal with it, where are those places I can hand them off to, and knowing ourselves to know which things are going to have a deep. We all have different things that trigger our own sensibilities in different ways. For some people, it's working with hearing about children experiencing abuse. Sometimes it's hearing about young people who have parents who are struggling with addiction or homelessness, whatever it is. And there's a number of reasons why that could be the case. It could be things that we've dealt with. It could just be things hit us a certain way, and that's totally okay too. But you have to know yourself enough to identify that when it's happening. For effective conversations, acknowledging what's going on and beginning the conversation, really starting to see, my dog just wandered in. She just opened the door. And so it's having those conversations, especially around things like what we're all dealing with right now, right? If we're talking to young people and you were to talk to them right now and say, oh, hey, how's it going? How's school or whatever, and not bring up, COVID or what's happening in the world, they would be very disingenuous, right? So when things are happening that we all are experiencing, or there's some like shared experience, address it. Like, talk about that elephant in the room. We all know it's a thing. No one here, is unaware. Let's just have a direct and honest conversation about it, and be the one to start it. Acknowledge those emotional reactions. Understanding that things are going to impact us differently. It's important that we know how to kind of manage and mitigate that, so you're not just like having a meltdown every time someone to share something with you that's personal. Ask questions about safety, advocate when necessary, know when to bring it up the line, know when not to, know the policies around when to make that CPS call, know when you don't have to, and then create those connections for deeper impact. Deepen that support and impact. Engage with organizations that are equipped to facilitate those conversations, and empower young people to set the agenda for those community conversations. So thinking about how do we empower them to be leaders? How do we empower other organizations to come in and fill in gaps that we might not be qualified to have conversations about? And again, not just knowing your role, interpersonally and individually, but also, your organization's role in addressing some of this stuff. And what are you not experts on? And that's okay. And let's get the experts in. And so I'm going to talk about just mindfulness briefly. I think mindfulness is one of those really, really basic just things that we can do that really makes a huge difference for people who have experienced trauma, or struggling with anxiety or things like that. And so here's one that's really great to use. I've done this a lot. I think it's really useful and effective, but doing the 5 senses, right? So you can do this as like kind of a meditation where I'm at home and I'm going to sit and just like take time. You can do it on the bus, you can do it at work, you can do it at school, like whatever. And you just close your eyes and start to imagine yourself in a safe space. And you start to focus around and start going through your 5 senses, right? What's something I can touch? What's something I can smell? What's something I can see? What's something I can taste? What's something I can hear, right? Starting to go through those. And you can do it as a grounding exercise too. So if I'm starting to have, really acute anxiety and I'm thinking about like, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? And I'm going down that rabbit hole where I'm thinking about step 250 of a what if scenario, and I haven't even gotten to step 3 yet in reality. I can take that deep breath and do that right here. So I can say, all right, I'm going to center myself and focus on where I'm at right now. I'm going to touch something, I'm going to taste something, I'm going to hear something, I'm going to focus on where I'm at. Another one I like to do a lot, and I used to do this with young people a lot, especially high school students I used to work with, is called progressive muscle relaxation. And there's lots of guides for this on YouTube, or you can get apps on your phone that do it. It's great, anywhere from 5 minutes to half an hour. And it goes through different muscles of your body and different muscle groups, and you just tense them up and then relax. And it's a really, really good way to focus on mindfulness and our bodies and kind of relax. It almost feels like getting a massage. I like those a lot. So what can mentors do specifically about, COVID-19 and what we're all going on, what's going on and what we're all dealing with right now? Following the latest news, making sure we're staying up to date on what is actually, coming from reputable sources, acknowledging what is going on and engaging in dialogue, giving ourselves that space and compassion to know that we are also being deeply impacted by this in a way that is, important to acknowledge. It's not just kids that are dealing with this, it's also us. And we have to understand that there are ways that we have to take care of ourselves before we can, really take care of our young people. And so the Search Institute, and we use this in a lot of our work. This might even, I don't think we've presented on this for you guys yet, but I put this in a lot of our trainings because I think it's a really good model. But so the Search Institute, which is a think tank that's based out of, I want to say Minneapolis, they do a lot of research on youth development. And so a few years ago, they came up with a model called developmental relationships, the developmental relationships framework. And so they identified these 5 things that young people, need from adults in their lives in order to positively develop. And I think that a lot of times when we're dealing with young people, especially young people with a lot of needs, we feel pressure. We feel a couple of things. One, the pressure to be everything for them, right? We feel the pressure to be, we have to just support them in so many different ways, provide them with so many different things because we feel like, we don't want them to miss out on anything. And the other thing is, we start to kind of undervalue too the support they might get from other spaces in their community. So whether that's, what they're getting at home from their parents, it might not be much, but it might be something. What they're getting from their neighborhoods, from their churches, from teachers at school, what are they getting from other spaces, and how do we start to, build on top of that? And so this is a way to start doing that, right? We can expand possibilities, we can express care, we can provide support, we can challenge growth, and we can share power. And every time we're talking to the young person in front of us, where our mentee is sitting there, and we're having a conversation, we can think about, how do I do one of these 5 things? Which of these 5 things can I really focus on today? Can I talk about expanding possibilities? How do I express care? And maybe these are things that they're getting somewhere else, right? Maybe, they have someone who really helps them challenge their growth. They have teachers at school that really push them to, grow and set goals, and that's great. But what they really need from you is someone to expand their possibilities, right? They need someone who's going to take them and show them, different possibilities of careers or things to study or books to read or, going to parks and museums, things like that. That's what they really need from you because they're not getting somewhere else, or, vice versa. And so, as we're talking about, again, thinking about it from that perspective of, we can't stop the experiences from happening, but what we can do is use the relationships and trust that we build to stop when that fork comes and different people experience these things as trauma, other people don't, trying to get our young people to be on that side of the fork where that experience does not, turn into a traumatic one. And one of the ways we do that is by building these strong relationships. We call them, protective factors, right? There's different protective factors that go around young people. And one of the biggest, most important ones is, trusting and caring relationships with adults in their lives that they can go to and talk about these things, that they could know that what they're experiencing isn't their fault or feel ashamed of, or be able to have spaces where they can process and heal. And even if we can't provide them with all of the support that they need, we can be a big part of it and help them get connected with other people who can provide them with more support. And again, acknowledging that, self-care is important. We have to take care of ourselves before we, can take care of anyone else. So know that it's okay to take a break, especially from the news, especially from reading everything in the paper. Being in this together, let them know, again, call out the elephant in the room, let them know we are both dealing with this. This is stressful and hard. Let's go through it together. Let's talk about it. And be communicative. Have healthy and supportive relationships are absolutely crucial. Again, we want to make sure that we can't change this experience. We can't make a viral pandemic disappear tomorrow. What we can do is work with the young people that we have relationships with to try to minimize the traumatic impact of navigating this experience. And that's the work that mentors can do right now. So we can create a plan of how we're going to stay in touch. So, making sure that we're adjusting that. Be mindful. It's going to be not just creating new traumas, but also, triggering past traumas. You're there for them. Establish that safe relationship, that this is a relationship you can bring your whole self, especially for a lot of young people where their home might be a source of their traumas. And so, and now that's where they're locked 24/7. And how do we start breaking them out of that and have those conversations? Be intentional about preserving the continuity. Don't just bail on them. Make sure you're there. If you've been meeting every other Friday, then try to stay every other Friday, as much as possible. Keep building those trustworthy and transparent relationships that we've been able to establish beforehand. And so, yeah, that's I'll open up for some questions. Like I said, put some stuff in the question box. This is something that I think is very it's an important topic, and so I want to make sure we're able to address specific needs and things that you all are seeing and experiencing day to day. So if you want to put something in the question box about things that you're currently dealing with or questions that you have, please do so. While you are doing that, if you take out your phone and if you can pull up the camera on your phone and take a picture, or not even take a picture, you take your camera and you point it up at the little QR code. A little link will come up with a SurveyMonkey link. And if you wouldn't mind taking like 5 minutes to just fill that out, that would be great. If not, if you can't make it work, then no big deal. It's in the email I'll send later, so you can just click the link and do it then. But this is a little bit easier for folks. And so yeah, I'll open up to questions. All right, well, I don't see any questions, so I must have done a really good job covering everything. But if you do have any questions, I'll send a follow-up email with the slides as well as a recording. And so feel free to send us an email. Let us know if you have some specific thoughts or you want extra support. We are more than happy to do that. We are here to help support you on, working our way through all of this. So I appreciate everyone's time. Happy Friday. I hope you all have a great weekend and had a great week. And yeah, thank you very much for your time, everyone.